I'm going to assume that we're all here because we have either an environmental commitment, a spiritual commitment, or both. And that those concerns are leading us to want to explore other perspectives and other resources. And an environmental commitment can be lived as a political commitment, and we can be acting as part of our political activism. It can be experienced as really an ethical issue, where we're either experiencing an ethics of care, where we want to care for the environment, or there's an ethics of right and wrong that allows us to see that these things are harmful and we want to avoid them. And it's also possible that the interest is more on the level of philosophical, that this is a civilizational shift and climate crisis, and this is an interesting thing to think about what the principles are at play. So we can experience them from all different places within ourselves. And for people who are seriously active in environmental issues and in climate issues, these are obviously issues that are going to require long-term and sustained action as well as collective action. And so it's a good question to ask ourselves, where are the inner resources that we're drawing on to sustain ourselves? And if it's a political issue, there are certain resources that come to mind. If it's an ethical issue, it's a philosophical issue. But here, the opportunity is to explore it as a spiritual issue, to think that we are in a spiritual crisis that is manifesting as an environmental and climate crisis. And once we allow ourselves to imagine it in that dimension, we can start to think that there's a lot of mutual nourishing and a new set of resources that can be drawn on. And in the Buddhist context, Buddha taught that all of our suffering, every form of suffering of every being, at the base is a manifestation of a false understanding of oneself as something separate, as something that we can objectify. This self-object divide, which in the versions of Buddhism where a non-dual view is what's being established or utilized, then we could say this dualistic distinction between self and other. And when we look at the environmental crisis, it's not a stretch to say that at heart, what we are seeing play out is a sense that there are human beings and then there's nature, right? Man versus nature. Which, if we think about it, what does that say about human beings? We're unnatural, right? And this is a very dangerous argument to make about ourselves, but taking Buddhist understandings of how this dualistic vision plays out, which one way to describe it is ignorance, the ignorance that sees a self as something solid, something real, and something that in some way exists under its own power or on its own, independent from and fundamentally separable from its environment, right? And this vision is what allows us to have the environment shift into the background, because between this self that's a human being or that's me, and the other, which is my environment or my context, which is more important to me? Self is, by definition, oneself, is in the center and takes more importance. And the function of that is to put everything else into the background. And it's interesting to think about ways in which we tell ourselves stories about our lives in which humans are the characters and mostly ourselves, but other people are moving around us and doing things to us and doing things with us or having, interactions with us. How much of everything else slips into the background? And for the next session that we have together, I want to propose exploring our individual biographies and trying to bring the more than human world out of the shadowy background, which is like the backdrop or the stage that we can stomp on and act out our lives, and see it as something that we are in a profound relationship with and bring it into the fore as a way to work with the underlying paradigm that we see at play in the environmental crises and in many of the social, moral, and political crises that we're experiencing, where there is this very strong break between self and other, and one of those is going to dominate. And part of the Buddhist view is that once we do have this strong bifurcation or perception of self and other as two very separate things, because that's not the case, that we are not ever fully separable from our environment, from others, that what we call other defines us as much as we are defining other, that all interactions affect both parties. It's not just us doing something to the earth. Surprise, surprise, the earth can also do things to us, and vice versa. So this kind of strong paradigm, which we've established as part of our civilizational view to an important degree, that when we start to look at the limits of where that's taken us, we can see ourselves with this tension between how we see ourselves as something separable and how the world is actually working around us. And if we accept that in reality we are not separable, that means that we've created a vision of ourselves in which we are missing pieces of ourselves. We are missing many pieces of ourselves. We have cut off elements of what we are and identify it as other and think that it's not part of us. And that causes anxiety, maybe in a kind of low-grade anxiety that manifests as desire. I want that. I need that. That should be here within the circle of what I call self. And so desire and the sense of lack are coming out of this false understanding of all those things as nothing to do with us and ourselves as isolated and lacking all of the other things that we are in reality connected to. And so we have, within this perspective, we have this very strong paradigm that in the form that we're living in, we can see it in hyper-individualism. There's an environmental crisis. I want to buy weapons so that I can defend my territory and my family and keep everyone else away. And I don't need to think about the consequences of my actions. I just need to make sure that my small space here is safe, which we see very quickly from the interdependent perspective, that's not possible. Your space is not a closed system that you can disconnect with weapons or with discourses from the environment around you. That is why you think you need weapons, because everything else does move in and out of your space naturally. So this hyper-individualist view, and then this alternative, which might seem idyllic when we think about it, but actually the earth has many collectivist societies, human societies that are more collectivist. There are many ways and many moments in which we do experience a sense of kinship. We do recognize our relatedness in ways that are very profound and fundamental. And so we can identify these two big paradigms. The paradigm of independent individuals, the paradigm of lack, the paradigm of needing to expand constantly, which makes sense if you think about we are part of everything, but we have cognitively restricted ourselves to just our own bodies, and that's too limiting, and therefore we need more. We need to move more of what we're calling other onto the side of the great gap so that it's me or mine, right? And so you have very naturally expansionist and extractionist models of relating to the planet. This is a very kind of cohesive paradigm that springs up from this experience of ourself and this belief that we are fundamentally independent of others. We are entities that are moving in the world among different entities. And then we have this other paradigm that is a way we have experienced ourselves in moments of life, in moments when we are feeling a deep and uncomplicated love, a love where a lot of conditions are not entering, where there's not a lot of attachment at play, where we are just wishing, looking, and feeling close to another and having all the empathy in the world and just wishing them to be happy. So that experience is an experience of profound connectedness. We create, communities wanting to build around this and some alternative paradigm. And I think it's a useful point to start to not see ourselves as we have this paradigm of hyper-individualism or capitalism or patriarchal struggle for power over one another or scarce resources. It seems like we think that the world is made around this paradigm and we're just socialized in this paradigm and everyone is acting along this paradigm and it's kind of all we have. It's useful to see that we could have other resources. We do have other resources. We have other models. We have other forms of wisdom that we can draw on when we start valuing and recognizing them. Part of the operation of this paradigm is to devalue the other paradigms. Right? It doesn't mean that they're not there. It means that we have a process of moving them from the margins where this system pushes them and maybe thinking about how they could be more in the center of our awareness. And a lot of the interest in thinking about indigenous ways of being and ways of knowing is part of valuing things that have been, oppressed, have been marginalized, but still have valuable sources of understanding and knowledge that we could learn from. And the starting point that allows us to imagine ourselves at is one in which we do have sources of inspiration. We do have places that we can learn from. We're not in what the environmental crisis often feels like, this unprecedented, human history has never faced it before, and therefore we have nothing to draw on. It's true it's unprecedented, and it's true we have not faced this magnitude of human-provoked climate change ever before, but it's not true that we don't have resources. There have been many, many Holocaust-like situations for people who have been displaced, people who have been kidnapped and made slaves, people who have been, expelled from their territory. We do have forms of collective and intergenerational trauma that we've experienced, and we do have other ways that are an alternative to the kind of relationship to the earth that has gotten us into this situation. So I just want to kind of invite ourselves to be starting from this place of awareness of the magnitude of the situation, but also knowing that we are not facing it completely empty-handed. And I would like to also think about when we think about our relationship with the planet, and it's good to think about it, right? Even that it can be a resource to just, let's think about what is the relationship that we have? What are the models, that we can draw on? I want to go back and think about how narratives and images can awaken one paradigm or the other, and how tremendously powerful narratives and storytelling is in reproducing paradigms and making paradigms seem like descriptions of reality versus just stories that we're collectively telling ourselves. And so the story of extraction, the more we can dominate and extract from the planet, the happier and the more prosperous our societies will be. This is a story. And therefore, we can tell other stories. And there are other stories available to be told. But the process of telling ourselves a story does normalize or naturalize that way of seeing and being. And the same is true of art. And I want to, drawing on Buddhist art and Buddhist storytelling, I want to look at some of what goes on to see if we can recover inspiration and resources from the story of the Buddha's awakening. There is an incredibly rich narrative tradition that has evolved over the millennia of talking about what happened in that moment. And I want to bring up from the background the presence of the earth in that moment. The narrative itself gives a very important place to the earth in the form of the earth goddess. That place is often diminished in the narratives and in the art, but it's there and it's not always diminished. And the earth goddess continues to be revered in different parts of India. She's powerful. She's fertile. She's absolutely manifesting what we can call the sacred feminine. So, taking this presentation of the moment before the Buddha sits down for his final night of meditation, during which he's going to awaken. And the whole scenario of Buddha's awakening is known in traditional classical Buddhist texts as Mara Vijaya, which is the conquering of Mara. Mara being the personification or the embodiment of all of the obstacles that arise on the spiritual path, everything that works against us as we try to awaken, and among those, distraction or temptation. And so famously at the moment of the Buddha's awakening, Mara comes and he's going to try to prevent this from happening. That's what obstacles seek to do, right? So we have here on the one side Mara, who's got a kind of classical bully pose. He's leaning on one of the women of Mara who are deployed as sort of part of his toolkit to distract or tempt the Buddha. And what we have in this scenario on the right side is the forces, or what's called the army of Mara. Okay, very military understanding of what's going on. And what we see here visually is on the left side, there's the Buddha. We notice he's larger than everyone else. So that already gives us an indication of who might win this particular struggle. And the figure who's kneeling and looking up at the Buddha underneath the tree, that is the earth goddess. Maybe not surprisingly or symbolically is largely effaced. That is the earth goddess. Okay, she is present at this moment. The earth is present at every moment that we live. She's given a visual representation to help us recognize her presence. So this image from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition here from Mongolia, a much later image, tells the story of the conquering of Mara in a form that for us might be a little bit more familiar. It's fast forward. The Buddha has been meditating. He's passed the night, sitting under the tree, moving through all the final layers of what's preventing him from being fully awake. And at that moment, what we're seeing in this presentation is the army of Mara is surrounding him on all sides from above, from the left and from the right. And we can see if we come a little bit closer, there are demons. On the right side, this is a figure who's doing black magic, using a mudra to harm the Buddha. Then if we look a little bit closer, we can see the classic part of this narrative, which is that the arrows turn into flowers as the army is seeking to attack the Buddha. The Buddha is no longer vulnerable to these attacks. But a very key piece of the narrative that anyone who's looked at Buddhist art will have seen, the hand, the right hand, with the fingers facing outward, touching the earth or moving down towards the earth. That is the earth-touching gesture. It's the mudra or gesture that's associated with the moment of enlightenment. It's probably the most frequently utilized or seen gestures that tells us that this is the Buddha and tells us what the Buddha is doing. In Sanskrit, it's the Bhumi Sparsha mudra. Sparsha is touching or contact, and Bhumi or Bhu is earth. And so one of the many names for the earth goddess is Bhu Devi, which is from Bhumi Devi, Bhu Devi. And here when we look at this image, we have the Buddha as the center of the stage. There his hand is in the earth-touching mudra, and we will come back later and see if we can find the earth goddess in this image. But now we can see what happens frequently in art is that the setting is no longer natural. He's surrounded by human beings. So this kind of transition that takes place where the more than human world becomes either decorative or invisible, and it's a human drama that is being narrated, but we see again and again this earth-touching mudra, even when it's very clear that the earth is not being represented. But the presence is continually evoked just by the term Bhumi Sparsha Mudra, earth-touching gesture, right? It's the iconic indication of awakening. And so we have kind of lingering in the language and in the artistic or in the visual idiom, we have being evoked again and again the presence of the earth in the moment of awakening. It is the moment of the earth-touching gesture, but where is the earth? And when we come back to this particular image, the earth goddess is present. In one of the narrative traditions that was translated into Tibetan and they're circling, she half emerges from the earth. Only half of her body emerges. That is her down there, half emerged from the earth. We can see she does not appear visually to play a very important role, but she is remembered. If we come back to this, we have her here. Again, in very much a supporting, maybe subordinate position, but she's there. There are other artistic traditions where the role of the earth goddess is much more celebrated and made much more visible and prominent. And these are associated with a narrative tradition in which the interaction that is to many other effects in other places, in other contexts, is not made visible, is given a very central role. And so in their narrative traditions that are supporting the earth, the images that we saw before, the earth-touching gesture happens because Mara is saying, who do you think you are? You haven't done anything. What makes you so great? who's your witness? I have my whole army here. You're just alone under this tree. And the Buddha says, the earth is my witness. And in some stories, she trembles and there's an earthquake, and that's the way she expresses her presence and her confirmation that the Buddha indeed is, qualified to be an awakened being, or has done what is needed to be an awakened being. And in other stories, she, makes a loud sound, she cries out, and the earth resounds with the sound of her confirmation. In this narrative tradition, when the Buddha calls on the earth goddess, and just as a reference, in this particular narrative tradition, the name that's used for her is Dharani, which is she who sustains, the sustainer. She's sustaining everything, the sustainer. And it's pronounced in the Thai tradition, where this narrative really is very active and very much represented visually as well. It's pronounced Thorani. And so this is a 19th century illustrated manuscript. We have underneath the Buddha that figure who we see is every bit as large as he is. Because of the dark background, she actually stands out a little bit more than the Buddha above her. And she is holding her hair and squeezing it. And in this narrative tradition, the hair of the earth goddess releases water that becomes a river. And we know that the earth is what decides what course any river takes. So she's controlling the course of these waters. She's producing the waters and she's controlling their course, and she sweeps away. She completely overwhelms the army of Mara, represented here on the right. So on the left, our left, as we're looking at it, on the left, there's the army, it's attacking. There are all these weapons, there are elephants, there are swords, there are arrows. On the right side, after she's squeezed her hair, she twists it and the water flows out. In this narrative tradition, it is the intervention of the earth that makes the awakening possible, because she is what eliminates all the obstacles present at the moment of awakening. And this tells us a few things. It tells us that her hair is powerful. She has powerful hair. The reason that she is able to squeeze her hair and have all of this water flow out, and the relevance of that act for this particular moment to witness the Buddha's work to become enlightened, his qualification, his success in bringing together all the conditions, is because every single act that the Buddha took in his path towards awakening was held in the earth as water. The virtue, the good deeds, the meritorious actions are understood to be recorded in the earth. The form of water comes from a tradition in Indian and Indic cultures where when a donation was done, when a major act of goodness, of spiritual benefit was done, it was ritually completed with a libation to the earth, by pouring water to the earth. And here's, as recently as the beginning of the 20th century in Burma, the consecration of stupas includes this moment of ritually offering water to the earth. And the idea is that she has been present, she has been watching, and every act leaves its mark in her, and she holds them, she records them, she remembers them, and therefore she is the perfect witness. And the way that she witnesses is not mutely, she witnesses by making visible what is invisible, because it's previous lives' actions that took place on the earth. And this narrative, which comes before the whole environmental crisis, is a way of saying to us, everything we do is leaving an impact on the earth. Everything we do. And she remembers. She has been with us, always sustaining us, and she remembers. And she is our witness. She will manifest whatever it is that we have put out there. She has it, and she will echo it back to us in key moments. And so we can take a little bit of time to enjoy all of this very vibrant artistic tradition. In the upper register, these are celestial beings who are observing this and celebrating this moment. Here, the before moment is presented on our right. The attack is happening. And then on the left is after. We can see that the space that's being allotted to Taurani, the earth goddess, is very substantial. The gold background would make it stand out even further. And it's very much accustomed to paint this moment as part of Buddha's biography in temples. Here, looking up, she actually gets more attention. A much closer image of that. And she does appear, even though if we look from a distance at a glance, this looks like there's one major figure, there's one actor in this play, and that actor is the Buddha. Supporting characters, maybe those demons are supporting characters, then there's some witnesses around who are not really doing anything. We have this process of a shift of paradigm where the Buddha is no longer on the earth. The Buddha is elevated up from the earth. The tree that had provided the shade and that had been his other silent witness that had been present becomes a very tiny bit of green above. The Buddha is the great hero who's done all of the conquering as if he had done it by himself. And there on the bottom we have just a faint memory that we might not even identify who that was, because that narrative of her presence and her role is not told very much, but she's there. And in Southeast Asia, the importance of the earth goddess is such that she is also represented separately. And if you have the occasion to travel in Thailand, when you see a woman who's squeezing her hair out, you can have a very high level of confidence that you are seeing the earth goddess. And you can even see her in the moment of dispelling the armies of Mara, doing this incredible thing that she's done without the Buddha being presented in the same piece of art. And so that is one possibility, to remember her presence, to see awakening as a group effort, to see it as something collective, versus to see it or to narrate it as the heroic struggle of one man against another man. So this is also the moment of awakening. This is Mara Vijaya. The hand is an earth-touching mudra, which is indicative of that moment. And then on the bottom, we have a representation of Mara, who is being conquered by the Buddha in that moment. And he's doing it all by himself. And we see that the Buddha is presented as a solitary figure, or so much larger and centralized and important than every other figure that he might as well be the only figure. We see him being visually elevated from the earth, so this denial of the connection and denial of the role and participation of the earth. This tendency to present levels of sacredness in terms of levels of how far above the earth each of the figures is. When you have one figure who's very much above the earth, elevated, sitting on a lotus, and other figures who are a little closer to the earth but still elevated above it, they will be bodhisattvas. They will be demonstrating the hierarchy of sacredness, where the index of sacredness is how separate from the earth they are. We can just see who has more levels separating them from the earth. And another question, the earth, the tree, the more the human world, it's just interesting for those who engage with Buddhist art and like to observe it, when we are seeing moments of enlightenment or we're watching the Buddha, where's the tree? You know, some artistic traditions will make the tree prominent and visible. And that behind him is the tree. He's also presented, although he's elevated from the earth, the artist has remembered that he's seated on a seat of grass that's donated to him by a humble grass cutter just before he's enlightened. But then the tendency is, even when he is in a natural setting, to ensure that the Buddha has many layers of separation from the earth. And we are seeing the reassertion of this paradigm of self versus other. So we have, the Buddha above the earth. And we remember, even when we see the earth goddess presented, she is below. And we are very visually hierarchical, and Indian art is very attentive to spatial hierarchy. So who is on your right is superior to who's on your left. There's a hierarchical relationship in Indian cultures between left and right, and between high and low, which we also share. So self, other. Then what are the different, once we have this paradigm at work, what we are, or what has gotten the central place in the world for social, and political reasons, humans versus nature. Nature becomes our other. Animals become our other. And this is something that we see that's worth really kind of questioning in many Buddhist presentations. The human realm and the animal realm are two separate realms. Whereas there are human animals and there are non-human animals, right? But once we have this self and other, we draw the line wherever we decide, collectively or linguistically. And so we can say the animals versus the humans, and we have said that for a very long time. Then man versus woman, white versus black, upper class versus lower class. And all of the forms of suffering just are set into motion by this dualistic paradigm that is not the final word. It takes the center. Self takes the center and pushes others over into the background, but this is a process that's come about. It's not the way things actually are. So just kind of a few reflections to think about what this is showing. It's showing that both of those paradigms are present in the Buddhist worldview, in the Buddhist cosmovision, in Buddhist cultures. We have both paradigms. We have the paradigm of the solitary hero, who goes off on a search on his own. And if we look at how many North American Buddhist communities are structured, we can see that there is a lot of solitary, it's my practice, and we're not very good on the collective and community piece. Not all Buddhist communities are as hyper-individualistic as others, but we can see that there is this tendency. We can see within the art from fairly early, there is this tendency to marginalize the presence of the earth, to marginalize, the tree, to push everything else, and to make the Buddha a central and much larger figure. So those are alternative paradigms that are at play. And at the same time, we do have narratives and we do have visual traditions where we can see the paradigm in which there's interconnection. There's, collective action. There's mutual care. There's gratitude. There's, awakening as, teamwork. And when we're moving through the Buddhist world, it's good to recognize that we actually can't just take everything and celebrate that everything that we have from Buddhist thought is going to support this particular paradigm, because we can literally see for ourselves that that's not necessarily the case. We are living in a world where they're both present and where the power has aligned itself with one paradigm, and Buddhist cultures also, over the millennia, any world tradition that can survive millennia has to learn how to align itself with power. And so we're going to see both of those in Buddhist thought, Buddhist narrative, Buddhist practice, and Buddhist art. But at the same time, we have at the heart this commitment to look at the ways in which our dualistic thought creates suffering, to turn towards suffering. And many, many resources that train us and support us to do so, to give us the courage to look at suffering, to give us a way to understand ourselves where facing that suffering is not something that we're going to have to do all alone. And in the subsequent sessions that we have together, I want to start exploring ways in which we can start to experience ourselves through this other paradigm, resources that we have for emotional resilience that is one of the strengths of Buddhist practice, is to work with being present with our emotions and learning how to work with them. And to see where the exploration of an environmental commitment and Buddhist thoughts and practice as a spiritual commitment can take us. So that's the journey I want to imagine us starting with this session, and I look forward to taking it with you. Thanks. I want to invite us to just sit for a few minutes and think about what is the nature of our commitment to environmental issues or to action in the moment of climate crisis. What sort of a commitment do we have? And we can consider in terms of different types of commitment. Maybe what we feel is not very focused. Maybe we're not even sure we would call it commitment. Maybe it's interest, concern. So we can just start there and see even where inside our body we're holding thoughts and feelings about what's happening right now in all the different ecosystems around us and to all of the different species that we share the planet with. You can just see what that awakens or where it resides within us. How does it feel? And then once we have a sense of where we're holding it, maybe we can look at how we relate to it. Do we think about ecological crises and the position we take relative to them as a kind of political commitment? Is it an ethical or moral position that we're taking? Do we experience it maybe as a philosophical commitment that we have? Just a matter of philosophical outlook or principle. We can take a moment to think about how it feels when we consider it in these different ways. How does it feel to imagine ourselves acting on environmental issues as a political issue for us? Versus as an ethical issue or a philosophical issue. What do those three modes activate in us that's distinct one from the other? And finally, let's see if we can connect with a space inside ourselves where we would hold environmental issues as part of our spiritual practice and think about environmental issues as spiritual issues. Where is that place? Inside ourselves where we receive the earth in a spiritual relationship. And now let's just take a moment to think about acting on our environmental commitment as spiritual practice. What would shift for us? How would it feel to experience our interconnectedness with all of the more than human world as a spiritual kinship. Can we rest for a few moments, experiencing ourselves as kin to all beings and all the world as a web of kinship? And then just resting here in this space where we might start to imagine that our spiritual practice manifests as this ecological commitment. What does that feel like? Maybe we just save in our emotional memory, our physical memory, this sensation of kinship and of a spiritual path that grounds us so firmly on the earth, so that we can come back to this sense as we need it later.